there, welcome to Skeleton Key Production. I'm Crown Grays Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're asking the question of how should history be taught? Now, obviously, I was a student at one point. I know for many people I still look like a student, but you know, at one point, I obviously was in school and I really loved history. But I really hated the way history was taught. I feel like history is the most important subject in school, not just because obviously I like it and stuff, but I think it is the most important because so many other things come from it. But I think it is the worst taught subject in school. Now, I also saw this when I started working in schools as a teaching assistant, right? So I worked in primary schools and in secondary school. And again, the way that history is taught, I still really didn't like it. Because the thing is, how history is taught in school, and obviously everyone's been to school and stuff, right? And they kind of know how the system works, right? You go, right, we're learning about this particular country from this particular time. So we're looking at Germany from 1850 to 1950, or we're looking at Russia from 1800 to 1900, whatever it is, yeah, right? And the thing is, it's like looking at history in that kind of way means that even people who are very interested in history, yeah, even when you've got students who are seem to be quite interested in history, it's a thing where they might know a lot about this particular era in this particular country. But when it comes to even that country there and looking at the history slightly before that or slightly afterwards, they have no clue. So they seem to be very good at telling the history of this place from this particular time, but they're not able to interlink this with the history of another place unless it tends to overlap. So for instance, Russia and Germany go to war in World War II. So they go, okay, right, here's some linkage now between learning about the Soviet Union, and learning about Nazi Germany. This is where the things are linked. And so what I kind of am suggesting here is I'm not saying this is gospel. I'm not saying this is the kind of curriculum and stuff, right? But I think that broadly speaking, that the curriculum ought to be changed so that how history is taught on a more thematic basis, right? Now, what I've tried to do with this channel is teach the history of it, right? But in a way of which, teaching history, how it's actually consumed by people, right? So people were interested in different themes, right? So some people were interested in war, some people were interested in gender, race, whatever it is, right? And so history is then presented to people in that way. So if you look at history documentaries, you look at books, you look at how people actually, even YouTube videos, of course, right? People go, right, I'm interested in this kind of history. I want to see more videos on this kind of history, right? So broadly, that's how people consume history. But how it's taught in schools is, again, just this very narrow, very limited thing. And also, it doesn't really teach big history. What this channel has tried to do, what I've tried to do with this channel rather, is a thing where we are teaching big history. We're trying to teach it in terms of this event is within the context of things that came both before and after it, right? So it's not just this kind of narrow thing where we pinpoint and look at the minutiae of this, right? We try to look at how this fits in with a wider narrative, right? But there's still people, people still have their own kind of biases and stuff, right? And I've been very open about my biases when I looked at the different videos, because the thing is, everyone is ideological, everyone is biased, right? I really hate this kind of fake objectivity, this fake impartiality and neutrality, right? So for instance, whether it's the education system, whether it's the BBC, whether it's CNN, whatever the kind of establishment organization that there is, right? They present something as being objective and they present things as being impartial, but their own biases end up coming out within that. So the problem with objectivity, right, is that when you try and present things as being objective, what you're actually doing is bits of your biases, whether you like it or not, whether you're even conscious of it or not, are coming through. And so you're now presenting this as the truth, right? You're teaching one side and saying, this is what the actual truth is. And so any deviation from that, any critique on that is therefore a critique on truth. And therefore, whoever's critiquing you must therefore be wrong. And actually, the world doesn't operate in that way. So history is not this kind of dull thing where you look at this thing here, you look at this event and go, this was the dates and this is the people, etc., etc. No, history is full of a debate, right? As you can see in the comment section for many of my videos, it's full of debate. And that's what makes history interesting, history, and the word story derive from the same source, right? And there's a reason for that. It's because history is the telling of a story, and obviously people have different views on that story, right? So within this video here, I'm going to kind of lay out, broadly speaking, again, it's not gospel, but laying out broadly speaking how I think history ought to be taught and how it actually manifests itself in terms of how both students and how like the general public kind of like consume things. Because whether it's students or whether it's adults, right, you speak to a lot of people, they'll be like, oh, I'm not interested in history. But when you talk about a particular issue, right, they are very much interested in that, and they know a lot about the history of that. And so history is important for building good citizens, yeah, because they need to understand what's going on. Like, in terms of like for voting and stuff, in terms of for all different things, right? So if you understand history and understand it in a wider perspective, you start to see patterns and you start to learn lessons from history. But if you just look at it from this very narrow lens, you are then, what's the word with regard to with horses? Yeah, they're, what's it called? They have blinkers, yeah, you have blinkered vision, you have like tunnel vision basically, right? So what this is gonna try and do is basically undo all of that. Now, the first kind of caveat I will say is the standard kind of, I'll say, for lack of a better word, the reactionary kind of way of looking at things, yeah, like the way that history used to be taught like 40, 50, 60 years ago, right, where there's just one narrative and it's a very kind of like jingoistic kind of way of looking at things, right? So, for instance, if you look at like the British Empire, for instance, how the history of the British Empire was taught like 100 years ago was, oh, we're going and doing great things and we're doing this, etc., and it's for the benefit of these people and blah 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 blah, and all the kind of bad things about it kind of swept under the carpet, or they're kind of justified as like, oh, the reason why we did that is because of that, etc., etc. So we're not going to talk about that because those kind of jingoistic narratives have kind of been done away with, yeah, in more recent time. Yes, obviously some people still believe in these like very, very simplistic narratives, yeah. But what's happened over the last, I'd say, like 60 years or so is that those narratives have been replaced, yeah, but they've not really been replaced with like a more objective kind of thing, yeah. So it tend to be a thing where, I've seen for myself, yeah, both within the universities and within schools, yeah, even down to primary school, it's, for lack of better word, and in some cases this is the case, whereby you have Marxist people, right? And again, there's nothing wrong with like someone being a Marxist. Obviously it's a free society, but the thing is, it's like education system is very skewed towards the so-called left, right? And therefore what is kind of presented then as objective facts, right, both in universities and in schools, is skewed in that particular way. And so what we're going to do with this video is kind of move away from that kind of like old narratives, yeah, and we're actually going to look at, two ideologies which I think actually kind of like determine like both public policy, yeah, and just the way that people actually like view the world. And that's through the lens of liberalism and through the lens of neo-Marxism. Now, I wouldn't say it's just Marxism, because the thing is, it's like since the 1960s with the evolution of the new left, Marxism isn't just this kind of like simple kind of materialistic thing, which it kind of has always been like historically. If you look at like classic Marxism, it's very focused on just like the economy and stuff, right? Whereas neo-Marxism kind of looks at things like gender and race and sexuality, etc., which we'll get onto a little bit later. But I'd highly recommend watching a YouTube channel, Ryan Chapman. He was really, really brilliant, and he was brilliant in the sense of, I'd always grown up around Marxists, yeah, or like, like even my dad's Marxist, right? Even though he wouldn't admit to being one, because he says a Marxist is someone who fully understands like all the teachings of Marx. But broadly speaking, I kind of grew up with this kind of view of like, so what the end goal for Marxists is about alleviating poverty, right? But then when I actually debated actual Marxists, one of whom was a teacher, then you kind of get the view that actually, as I said, it's nothing to do with poverty. Yeah, the bare minimum is that there should be no poverty. They are saying that, the problem with capitalism is that from its very nature is that it's exploitative, yeah, and that's the real problem. So even if everyone is rich, the problem with it is that the system itself is an evil system. So we're going to unpick some of this. I'm going to go through some of the themes within this video, yeah. So hopefully you stay tuned with me, and obviously don't forget to like and hit the subscribe button if you like what you're seeing already. And yeah, obviously in the comment section, let me know your thoughts on this. Let me know whether you agree with what I'm saying or disagree, or whether I've missed something out and stuff. I love hearing different like points of views and stuff, even views actually in particular views that are contrary to my own, yeah, because that's how we learn, that's how we like, that's how we grow and stuff as people, right? So without further ado, we're going to jump into this now. So first of all, looking at liberalism and Marxism, so historically, when I first started the channel, like I did videos on the history of liberalism and history of Marxism. Obviously, those videos are quite dated, more in the sense of like there was no green screen. How I presented videos wasn't necessarily the best. It wasn't necessarily the most professional. But hopefully, those videos, the content of those videos are still hold up, right? So if you just listen to it as a kind of as a podcast, those videos are still quite good, right? But the point with it is this kind of look at liberalism and Marxism from first principles, right? And again, so the core tenet of liberalism is basically aiming towards freedom, right? And how you aim towards freedom, because we're all born free, yeah, we all have natural rights, yeah, we all have a right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and all the rest of it, right? So you're born with these rights. And so society and the different mechanisms of society, the kind of illiberal mechanisms of society, put arbitrary barriers in your way. So no one can help being born poor, no one can help being born white or black or male or female or straight or gay, etc., etc. Yeah, no one had any choice in that, right? We were just kind of plopped into this earth, kind of how we were, right? And what the liberal worldview would kind of say is, let's remove those arbitrary barriers. Like in the words of Martin Luther King, yeah, I want my 4 children to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So basically, well, we're going to get into this a little bit later with regard to the specific themes and stuff, but this is a broad kind of view of what liberalism is. It's about the removal of arbitrary barriers, right? And that way, when you remove these arbitrary barriers, then anyone can succeed or fail or whatever, but they're free to do those things, right? The Marxist worldview, however, is completely different. So the first principle is not trying to aim towards that freedom and stuff, right? What it's aiming towards is communism, right? So communism is the kind of utopia where everything will be like, sunshines and rainbows. It's almost kind of trying to create like heaven on earth in a way, right? So what the kind of core tenets of Marxism is, yeah, right? And in this case here, I'd rather say Neo-Marxism, because again, it ties into what we're going to talk about later, right? Is that from first principles, the world is split between 2 different classes, yeah? It's very much a kind of good versus evil kind of like narrative, right? So on the side of good are the oppressed, right? And on the side of evil are the oppressors. So within traditional Marxism, right, you have, as it were, the bourgeoisie and you have the proletariat, right? So the bourgeoisie, they are in control of the society and they are oppressing the proletariat, right? The proletariat are the workers, they're the working class, right? So everything within the society is looked through this lens of, you have an oppressor and they're oppressing the oppressed, right? And the only way to reach communism, the only way to like reach this utopia is by the oppressed overthrowing that system of oppression, yeah, and basically being the ones to take control, right? So that's what we're going to look into now. Now we've kind of covered the overall core tenets of both ideologies. Now we're going to look at examples of this with regard to different themes. So the first theme that we're looking at now is class. So again, people are born rich, some people are born poor, etc. But the point of liberalism is basically to say, actually, we need to remove kind of class-based barriers, right? So historically, in England, for instance, up until 1918, right, poor and working class men couldn't vote in England, right? So the only people before that period who could vote, some at a certain point it was the middle classes, but then even the middle classes couldn't vote at like kind of like past like kind of like the early 1800s, right? And so the kind of system that you had then was one which was very, very class orientated, right? If you look back historically at feudalism, which we covered in other videos, right? The king and his noblemen, right? They are the ones who are in control of the whole of the society, right? And the vast majority of the population have no say in how the government should be run. And their lot in life is very much determined, yeah, by this kind of like strict class system. And obviously, in some cases, there was some social mobility, but you had to do a lot to kind of rise through the ranks, right? So social mobility wasn't really what was allowed in the state. And actually, in most other societies around the world historically, for the vast majority of human history, there's not been much room for social mobility. So what liberalism basically saying is the removal of that. So actually, let's allow people to have their kind of natural born rights, and regardless of what class you're born into, you have the ability to move up, like kind of up the social ladder, and so there's room for social mobility. However, the Marxists will look at a class and basically say, as we said before, there are two classes. You have the oppressed and the oppressors, yeah, and so i.e. you have the bourgeoisie and you have the proletariat, right? So anyone who has to work for someone else is part of the proletariat, right? So even if you hire, well, in the case of Karl Marx himself, right, he had a servant, yeah, which he had for nearly all of his life and stuff, right? And so even in Marx's own example, him hiring her labor means that he is now in a exploitative position, right? So by him hiring her, right, she is working for him. This is basically so-called wage slavery, right? So he's paying her just enough to get by on, right? So that she'll keep turning up for work each day. And she doesn't really have many options, and so like she's basically trapped within this kind of oppressed system. And even if she decides to like not work for him anymore, she can only go to another like kind of like capitalist, right? So this is broadly how kind of things are looked at, right? So it doesn't matter, you know. So even if someone is born poor and stuff, right? Even if they kind of rise through the ranks, they are just a traitor to their own class, right? So they've joined the bourgeoisie class, but they're basically betraying the proletariat, right? So the Marxists wouldn't actually want social mobility in that kind of sense, because their view is that, you know, unless everyone is kind of like lifted up, yeah, then like no one ought to be kind of lifted up, right? This is broadly how the two, you know, liberalism versus Marxism, this is how they view class. Now, if we look at capitalism, right? So how the liberal looks at capitalism is much in the same way as what Churchill said with regard to democracy, which is that it's the worst system apart from all systems which have been tried from time to time, right? So capitalism is not perfect. Obviously, you have like you know, some people getting very, very rich. There's great levels of inequality. Obviously, you have some exploitation as well. Some workers, you know, are not getting paid as much as they ought to be paid, etc., etc. But broadly speaking, yeah, having a capitalist society, right, you know, is the best way of creating wealth in the first place, and then it's also the best way of which like poor people, even people right at the bottom, yeah, their standard of living rises over time. And societies which haven't had capitalism, you know, the poor stay poor, right? And it's only in capitalist societies where the poor, yes, they might still be poor, but relatively speaking, they are getting better off as well. So obviously you have great levels of inequality, but also the material well-being of the poorest citizens is improved. However, with the Marxists, yeah, they would say that actually it doesn't matter. As we said before, it doesn't matter about that. You know, it doesn't matter about poverty alleviation. Yeah, the fact that we have capitalism at all means that you have exploitation. Yeah, means that you have one class which is controlling another class, right? And that the whole system is kind of being set up in this way. We kind of dangle a little carrot, yeah, to the poor, and basically say, oh look, if you know, if you buy into this system and stuff, yeah, you might have a chance of joining the bourgeoisie. You might have a chance of becoming super rich and wealthy, etc., etc. But actually, this is just a mechanism by which the elites basically kind of maintain their own power and legitimacy, right? And so for the Marxists, yeah, the way to basically get rid of this system, yeah, is again, the proletariat need to overthrow capitalism. Yeah, they need to overthrow a bourgeoisie. And what they need to do is set up socialism and then eventually lead on to communism, right, which is this kind of utopia. So that's broadly how, again, the liberal worldview views capitalism and how the Marxist worldview views it. And also as well, I said in this video for regard to history, yeah, but actually you could include this for English and also for geography, because many of the kind of like, you know, the humanities in school cover these different topics, yeah. So I'm speaking mainly about history, but just know that what I'm saying isn't just restricted just to the realm of history. The next thing we're going to talk about is regard to democracy, right? So as we've already said with regard to Churchill quote, you know, it's the worst system apart from all others that have been tried from time to time. So democracy is basically, you know, regardless of your class, regardless of race or gender, etc., etc., every adult, and obviously you can define like when people become an adult, is that 21, is that 18, is that 16? That's a whole different debate for another day. But the whole point is that everyone who is a citizen, everyone who's an adult citizen, has equal say in how society should be run, right? So rich or poor, whatever. So that means that people have a say in how the system it operates. They have a say in like what leaders end up coming to power and stuff, right? And also, if they don't like those people, then they have a means of removing them, right? So that's basically how democracy is viewed through a kind of liberal lens, right? So it's more about focusing on voting rights. It's more focusing on universal suffrage, yeah, and making sure that everyone has a say within a democratic system. However, Marxists would say this is all just window dressing, right? This is just a way of the elite basically covering themselves, and so it doesn't matter whether you vote for this party or that party. At the end of the day, the system is run for by and of the elites. It's run for by and of the bourgeoisie, and therefore this is just another way of them just trying to legitimize their own power and stuff, right? So they basically say, oh, look, you plebs, right? Kind of, you have some say, oh, you can pick this leader or that leader, but really, really and truly, you don't actually have much choice. Yeah, regardless of what it is, the government is still going to be set up for the benefit of the bourgeoisie, and it's it might do some little policies here and there to keep the poor happy, but by and large, it's just bread and circuses, right? It's just a way of distracting people, and it's a way of just keeping them happy and stuff. Just so that the system can keep ticking over. So this is how the Marxists view democracy, and what they are basically saying is that what should happen instead is, instead of a thing where everyone has voting rights, it needs to be a system where the proletariat overthrow the kind of bourgeois state, and it needs to be real democracy, as the Marxists would call it, and it needs to be this so-called dictatorship of the proletariat, right? This is one where you don't have the bourgeoisie having a say in the system. You completely either remove them, and obviously there's a debate of how one would remove them. In practice, how this is basically with gulags, etc., etc. But the point is that the system is now going to be set up for by and of the proletariat, right? So it's not a thing where you have universal suffrage. Now you just have a situation where the proletariat act in their interest. And actually, when we talk about the proletariat, in all these cases, whether people want to accept this or not, in reality, the system is one in which the intellectuals, the Marxist intellectuals themselves, who are, the kind of the vanguard of this revolution, right? These are the ones who, when the revolution happens, these are going to be the ones who are going to be in control of the new system, right? So it's a system where all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, right? As George Orwell said. So this is how democracy is kind of viewed, So if you're teaching history, it needs to be the history of democracy as a kind of process, but also allow there to be critiques, allow there to be Marxist critiques, and basically people saying, do people really have a say in the system? Is democracy really this great of a thing? So now we're in classrooms, right? Now there's a debate about these kind of things, not just for democracy, but also for all the other kind of things which we have spoken about in this video and will talk about in this video. There needs to be an encouragement of debate, rather than just this is inherently good, because there might be some students who will and might end up having different views, and so you can only have an informed citizenry when you're presenting both sides of an argument and letting them come to their own decision. The next thing that we're talking about is regard to the nation, right, or nationalism in general, right? So the liberal worldview kind of looks at it in terms of, right, there's only three ways to realistically kind of have a developed society. So past the kind of tribal kind of level where it's everyone in their family and stuff, as one would have in a kind of original kind of state of nature. Having a more complex society that has thousands, if not millions of people, right? It's a little bit more complicated than that. And so there's only three ways in which you can actually organize society. One is the city-state. The second is empire. And the third is the nation, right? So regardless of city-states, in an ideal kind of liberal world, right, it'd be a situation where everyone basically either lives within a city or just the surrounding area, right? And people can come up with whatever policies they want. They can have high taxes here, low taxes there, etc., etc. But basically in a kind of confederate kind of system, right, each kind of nation in the world would basically kind of be able to come up with its own policies, and you try out different things. It's the kind of laboratories of democracy, so people are free to move between these different places, and you go, oh, okay, cool, this worked in this place and that policy didn't work in this place, etc., etc. And so everyone kind of just lives, with the government being close to them, being accountable to them, right? And it's not this kind of vast thing that's far away and which isn't really accountable and which isn't actually really protecting their liberties, right? So that's why kind of small states such as Singapore, such as Switzerland, etc., such as Liechtenstein, all these kind of places here are very small states, and yet the people there are freest. Well, in some areas with regard to Singapore, that's a different case. But like people broadly speaking are freer and more prosperous and just have better standard of living in general, and you have much more accountable government in smaller countries, right? However, the problem with this is that when you have these city-states, or when you have these kind of like small countries which have like less than 5 billion people, right? When they are next to empires, right, they are too weak to be able to stand up against them, right? Because they only got a handful of people. Even if they mobilize all their population, they're not going to be able to mobilize in the same way an empire can. So an empire is vast, and an empire can basically dominate these smaller states. So it's either going to invade them, or it's basically going to bully them, or it will like infiltrate, because obviously you only need a handful of people within one of these city states, yeah, to basically like turn the city state like kind of like on the side of like the empire, right? So you see this time and time again throughout like world history. You see this with ancient Greeks, you see this with the Romans, you see this time and time again, right? So small, tiny little nations, right, which are governed themselves, end up being swallowed up by larger empires. And within empires, right, we're going to talk about colonization a little bit later here, but within empires, the people are not free, right? So even in a so-called liberal empire, such as the British Empire, right? And I say kind of liberal like this, yeah, right? Even in somewhere like the British Empire, it's a situation whereby the people in the colonies, whether it's in India, or whether it's in America, or whether it's Canada, wherever it is, right, they don't have a say in how the empire itself ought to be governed. And also as well, obviously, historically, most of the people within Britain didn't have a say in how the empire should be governed, right? But like, so that's even in like the best kind of cases with empires. But in obviously the worst cases of empires, you just have straight out tyranny, right? And every person within that empire is just a subject, right? Rather than a citizen. So the rights of the people cannot really be guaranteed within an empire, right? Because it's so vast and it's so just overwhelming, and it's geared up towards just a show of force, yeah, right? Everything is all geared towards like just force, and therefore the people don't actually have much real say. So the best way to actually have a free society, right, one that is strong enough to defend itself, but also one which is like small enough to protect the rights of the individual, right, is a nation. So the best way to organize a society through the liberal worldview is through the nation state, because everyone within that nation state, as we've covered in other videos with regard to like, when did England become a nation, etc., etc., everyone within that nation accepts we are this and that's just that, right? So regardless of who's the leader in England or China or South Africa or wherever it is, right, if we have a nation, everyone accepts, okay, this is, whether we like the leader of the country or not, whether we voted for the leader or not, this is basically what a nation is, right? So this means that we're all united, yeah. So even if goes a different way, which we didn't necessarily like, we still have enough kinship here to actually recognize that, we're all in this together. So that's how the liberal will basically see the nation. Yeah, again, it's not perfect. Yeah, there's obviously issues with regard to exclusion, like kind of, if you have a nation, there's an in-group and an out-group. But still, broadly speaking, this is the best way to kind of organize a developed society. However, the Marxists would look at this and say this is false consciousness, right? So the different nations of the world, right, as it said, the proletariat have no nation, right? Like the workers of the world unite. So it doesn't matter where you're from, whether you're from India or this place, etc., 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 right? The point is that you're all working class, and so you're all united in that, right? So that's the main aim. Yeah, they want internationalism, they want one world government. Yeah, in an ideal communist society, right, there is no government, because you've kind of, with socialism, you've kind of done away with the need for a government, and everyone is just living in complete utopia. So this is kind of the aim of the Marxists, yeah, to basically like get rid of the nation state. Yeah, they see this as a barrier, they see nationalism as a barrier to this internationalism, which is what they're actually aiming towards, right? So that's how the nation is kind of viewed, right? Now, if we talk about colonization, yeah, if we talk about the empire, right? So what we said earlier with regards to the kind of more reactionary kind of way of looking at history is like this kind of narrative of, oh yeah, we colonized these different places in order to bring them civilization and to bring them roads and railways and blah blah blah, all these kind of things, yeah, right? Now that's used as an ad hoc justification, but the people who are actually doing these things are not, that's not their primary goal. Yeah, we didn't conquer India for the benefit of the Indians here. We did it for the benefit not even of the nation itself, like not even of like the host nation, but actually of the tiny elites within that host nation. So this is what we've covered in other videos as well. We're going to talk about like the scramble for Africa, we're going to talk about like the partition of India, etc. We're going to look at like the Biafran Civil War. Definitely like check out all these things, right? So that's broadly what we kind of talk about. So the liberal worldview is a little bit more nuanced, because it goes like, right, well, we look at this topic of empire. One empire is different from another in terms of like how it's administered, and over time and in different colonies it's administered in different ways, right? So if we take, for instance, the British Empire, right, compared to the French Empire, which we covered in other videos, right, the British Empire tended to be a little bit more, have, as I said, benign neglect. So it kind of just allowed the natives to kind of get on with what they were doing, as long as it didn't interfere with British interests. So in terms of foreign policy, in terms of the right to kind of like set up businesses there, etc., etc., and the kind of thing with regard to the military, right? So as long as the natives didn't interfere with these things, the British kind of just allowed them to do what they wanted. However, the French tended to kind of run their colonies with the thing of this kind of civilizing mission. So these places are an integral part, not just of the French Empire, but of France itself. And therefore, we need to make good French men and women of the natives, right? So we need to basically civilize them. So many other empires have kind of like had a very kind of top-down thing where they try to impose their will on people. But some empires have just, like the Mongols, for instance, just allowed people to do what they want as long as they pay the money. As long as they pay the taxes, they don't really care. So empires change from place to place. So how the British Empire administered things in Canada is very different from how it administered things in Kenya, very different from how like it was administered in Nigeria, and even within Nigeria, right? How like southern Nigeria compared to northern Nigeria was governed, it was completely different, So in some places you had more direct rule, in other places you had more indirect rule, where they ruled through local chieftains and local rulers, You see the same with India as well with regard to like the princely states. So it's a little bit more complicated than this kind of like just the standard kind of narrative which you have, which is the kind of Marxist lens, which is, and there's a hint of truth in this, because these empires were exploitative, both for the natives and for the domestic policy, right? And there's not necessarily a huge correlation between the countries which had empires and the ones which were wealthy. So for instance, Portugal, they had a colonial empire far longer than the British did, and they had far more slaves than the British did, for instance, but still Portugal was poorer and still is poorer than Britain was, right? Meanwhile, Germany, which had like tiny amounts of colonies and which didn't have any slaves at all, they end up being much richer than many of these other places. And even Switzerland, which obviously landlocked, had no colonies at all, but was still richer than Britain, which at the time had the largest empire the world had ever seen. So it's a little bit more complicated than kind of saying, oh, the reason why some countries are poor today and some countries are rich today is because, like, evil colonizers kind of went to these places and robbed all the wealth and left these places poor. It's far too simplistic, but this is kind of, broadly speaking, the Marxist worldview. So the Marxist worldview is that empires are basically the final stage of capitalism. So if you read the works of Vladimir Lenin, he's basically kind of saying that how the world was at the turn of the last century, this is a manifestation of capitalism, right? So they're coming to an end of exploiting their own domestic population. So now they're having to go elsewhere in order to exploit other people, right? So when all those resources and all the exploitation that they can do is kind of, when they run out of the level of exploitation that they can actually do, eventually capitalism is going to self-implode, and then that's when the kind of worldwide socialist revolution will happen. This is what Marxists actually believe, So they believe capitalism will exploit things up to the maximal point, and when it can't exploit any more people, then the whole system will collapse in on itself. So they're always predicting the collapse of capitalism, right? So that's a very simplistic kind of way of looking at things, but I mean, that's just my take anyway, being someone who's looked into the history of these things. But still, it's important for students to be taught the different histories of that. So when in schools they've had conversations about the British Empire, yes, obviously they need to be taught about the good sides of it and also the bad sides of it, right? And if the whole narrative of it, as happens in schools nowadays, was that it was just bad and everything was all just exploitative, etc., etc., it misses the nuances of how the levels of colonization changed in different places and different times and with different empires, etc., etc. So you get a very simplistic view of like the empire rather than a more nuanced one, which it actually kind of deserves. But still, nonetheless, it's important that people get both sides of the thing, yeah. Because if you just teach the liberal worldview in all these cases, yeah, then you're going to alienate people as well who have different worldview as well, right? And now finally, we're going to be talking about the kind of social studies kind of side of it, yeah. So we're talking about the themes of race, gender, and sexuality, right? So a lot of overlap in these. So if you look at kind of like more classical Marxism, it doesn't really touch on these kind of topics here. It's very much focused on materialism. It's focused on just the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. However, since the 1960s or so, you had the rise of the New Left, right? So the New Left, this is where kind of classical Marxism kind of deviates from kind of like Neo-Marxism. So Neo-Marxism is kind of more intersectional, right? So it's looking at not just class, but it's also looking at race and gender and sexuality. So in these kind of like liberation movements, as they were called, throughout the 1960s and 70s, you end up having the rise of people kind of looking at things and being like, actually, it's not just that it's a capitalist society run for by and of the bourgeoisie, it's also a white supremacist society, right? So the liberal worldview is kind of saying, race is, it's an illiberal thing. People shouldn't be, arbitrarily stopped from doing things, from having certain jobs, from marrying people, from having children with other people, from even sitting on park benches and stuff, yeah, just because of something which they had no say on, right? So race for the liberal is not an important thing. It's a completely arbitrary thing which has been imposed on society and which we need to kind of do away with. We need to stop talking about race, basically. We need to kind of like move past this, and remove the barriers which still hold black people back, which still hold these or that people back, but the focus shouldn't really be primarily on this. However, the Marxists would basically say that no, or rather the neo-Marxists would say no, by even challenging that, you are upholding the white supremacist system, yeah? And therefore, again, it's the same kind of lens of oppressed, being oppressed by the oppressors, right? So it's the thing of, people of color are oppressed by the system of white supremacy, and therefore people of color with their allies, yeah, need to overthrow the system of white supremacy, and then we'll have a system where they're, we live in utopia, where there's no more racism. So for them, even the questioning of like, is the system white supremacist, yeah, means that you're on the side of the white supremacists. In the same way, to even question whether this narrative of the proletariat and bourgeoisie, to even question that means that you're automatically on the side of the bourgeoisie and therefore you're on the side of evil, right? So this is a way of kind of like seeing how the Marxists kind of like view things, right? So that's how it's viewed with regard to race. When it comes to gender, it's a similar kind of model, right? So you have patriarchy, right? So the patriarchy oppresses women, therefore women and their allies need to overthrow the system, they need to overthrow a patriarchal system, and therefore then like, gender won't matter anymore, like kind of like, sex won't matter anymore, and therefore, then we'll have like kind of like this kind of utopian system, right? And all these kind of systems, whether it's white supremacy, whether it's patriarchy, it's all tied in with this capitalist system, yeah? So it's basically saying that the capitalist system is not just exploiting people based on class, it's also exploiting people with regard to race and with gender and with sexuality, which we're going to get onto now. So talking about sexuality, right? Again, we have heteronormative society, i.e. straight society, right, is oppressing homosexual society, right? So homosexuals therefore need to align themselves with their allies, and they need to overthrow this heteronormative society, and then again we'll reach this kind of like nirvana, right? So looking at it through these kind of lenses, right, you can see that how the liberal is looking at things in terms of how do we remove these barriers, right? The Marxist is looking at this and saying these barriers are fundamentally part of the thing. So even if you kind of tweak some of the things, even if you reduce like some of the levels of oppression, right, the fundamental point of the system is that it's one of exploitation and oppression, and therefore there's no use in trying to tinker around and make things slightly better. What needs to be done is the whole system needs to be overthrown, right? And so that's basically what the Marxists are looking at, and that's what the liberals are looking at. So now we've kind of covered all of these kind of like topics, right? Now we have to kind of think about like, so how this manifests itself in schools, yeah, right? So the student comes in, they learn about a topic, right? Today students were learning about the history of class, right? And we're going to look across time, we're going to look across different nations. So the liberal worldview would say blah, 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 blah with regard to class. However, the Marxist view would say blah, 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 blah with regard to class. Now that you understand a bit more of the history of this, obviously most of the course is going to be, most of the lessons going to be talking about the history of it. Then at the end of the lesson, then it's like, okay, you as the students, what do you guys think about it, and what do you, why do you think that? So therefore, there's now debates here. So some people are like, oh yeah, I think that this is a truer interpretation of this theme. I think that this is that's wrong, and it's wrong for this reason. Blah, blah. So there's now a debate. So now history has gone from this very boring thing where people are going, you have to learn this because of that, and you have to do it. So now it's becoming a thing where both, people, regardless of who the teacher is, the teacher could be left-wing, the teacher could be right-wing, it doesn't matter, right? At the end of the day, they're presenting both sides of the argument. So even if the teacher, I'm not saying the teacher should do this, but even if the teacher were to say, I fundamentally believe more in this school of thought, right? You as the students are still being presented other school of thought. So it doesn't matter. Like, hopefully the teacher doesn't say what their own views are, right? But it wouldn't matter at that point because the students are getting both sides of the argument, right? So this is broadly speaking how things should kind of be taught in schools and stuff. And what I would kind of say with regard to liberals viewing Marxists, right? So the problem with within the kind of liberal worldview, as we kind of said, it's about aiming towards freedom and the removal of barriers. And so if one looks at Marxism as just another kind of ideology as such, right, you'll assume that you have the same starting point and the same end point, right? And you're just disagreeing about the means. So if you look at like conservatives versus liberals, for instance, just broadly, those terms are quite meaningless, but to some extent they have some legitimacy. It's very complicated, but yeah. So broadly speaking now, some conservatives will say, we want to have the same end goal, but we just disagree on how to get there. And, we have to kind of look at things and be a bit more cautious, etc., etc. It's the old kind of debate between Edmund Burke, who was a conservative, and someone like Thomas Paine, who's more of a radical, more of a kind of, liberal, but someone who wants a lot of change very quickly. So there's that kind of debates there, right? However, if you're debating with a Marxist, right, the Marxist isn't coming from the same starting point as you and is not trying to get to the same end goal as you. So you as a liberal can be debating with them and you'll be arguing all different things here, but you're not arguing about the means, because even if you agree with the same means as them, it still is a thing where, and even if you have the same kind of end goal as them in a particular field, it still is a thing where regardless, you even questioning it, you even kind of saying, oh, let's tinker with the system, let's try and make these liberal reforms to the system, right? They look at it as, no, like what you're trying to do is basically uphold and legitimize this oppressive system, So either you're with us, and you're trying to overthrow the system, or you're against us, and trying to make things a little bit better isn't actually getting rid of the system. You're part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So I hope that now you kind of have a bit more of a wider view of what liberalism is and what Marxism is, and also let me know in the comment section what you think about these different proposals, right? And the next video is going to be the last video with regard to these kind of political videos, and actually, well, it won't be the very, very last one, but as I've said before with regards to my channel, I've always wanted to go onto film reviews, So we're going to have a video in 2 weeks' time, which is talking about, doing basically an introduction for what the film review side of the channel will be looking like, because I've spoken about all the history and all the politics and stuff that I want to for the time being. So the next video is going to be talking about third world socialism, and basically talking about how different countries at the time when they got independence, went down different routes, right? And basically saying what systems tended to work for countries and what systems didn't tend to work for countries, because I think that's quite instructive, to understand where countries are at the moment and what policies would be good for the countries to kind of continually advance on. And some countries haven't really advanced yet, but like since where they were at the time of independence. So it's looking at what policies would work for them in terms of helping them to advance. But again, as we've kind of said before, I'm a liberal, right? I'm in favour of capitalism and in favour of all these kind of things, and like throughout this channel, I'm not trying to present myself as being this kind of objective like person, right? I'm saying this is what this side think and what that side think, but I'm also giving you my own opinion because I'm not going to pretend that I'm objective truth, right? And I'd like to hear what your objective truth is as well, right? So in the comment section, if you agree with what I say, then like let me know. If you disagree with it, I want to hear even more from you. Yeah, right. I want you to tell me exactly why I'm wrong and what you would kind of say instead. But with all that being said, have a great day and bye.